Man, great cameras have basically been falling out of the sky in 2020. There are so many to choose from. I'm gonna focus a little bit on the Canon R and where it sits in the current lineup. It's on the older end. We've got the RP, that's also more recent and cheaper. And then very recently we hit the R6 and the R5 at the high end. So what do you choose? Hopefully gonna help you try to decide on that. I run a photo and video production business with my wife, and we've been using the R for a year now, very steadily. We actually bought it as a backup camera to the 5D Mark IV because I didn't think anything was going to replace the 5D. I've been using 5D for years, but the R is what we ended up bringing to most of our jobs. So there must be something to it. So even though all these cameras weren't released at the same time, I think they make sense to all be for sale at the same moment because they are all competitive with each other. Why did the branding go so far along the EOS R line? Like, just call it the Canon R. Let's remind ourselves, what's the competition here? We've got the RP for about $1,000. And then there's the R for about $1,800. This is USD. The R6 at $2,500. And then the R5 at $3,900 USD. That's pretty wide range. Canon's really covered all the bases. Does it make sense to buy, 4 RPs instead of an R5? I don't know. We'll figure that out. Other competition I won't cover in detail, but I gotta mention it. There's the Sony a7 III, the Fuji X-T4, and the Nikon Z6. They're all in about the same range as the R. So, Google them if you want to know more, but I won't be covering them in any detail in this video. Okay, so the R, we've had it for about a year. We've used it a lot, but we really put it through its paces recently on our trip to Europe, where we shot over 40,000 photos in just a few weeks, plus a couple of YouTube videos. And if you're wondering, how am I magically changing the travel photos in this picture frame behind me while I'm talking? It's not magic. It's just the sponsor of this video, Meural Wi-Fi photo frame powered by Netgear. Looking at our travel and family photos on this 15.6-inch anti-glare matte screen has the same feeling as looking at slides on a light table. There's that gentle push coming from behind it where it feels like it's slightly glowing and the colors are a little bit richer and more saturated than on a standard print, but it's not so bright that it lights up the room. In fact, it's detecting the ambient light levels in your room and setting the brightness based on that. And if you turn all the lights off, it's going to power off as well so that it's not a glowing night light in the middle of the night. You may not want it keeping you up. So it's always set to just the right brightness, and it's also intelligent enough to know the orientation. So if you spin it from horizontal to vertical mode, it'll not only rotate the photos, but it can also intelligently just display photos that match that orientation. So as you switch back and forth, it'll show you the right images. I really like it so it can show our photos, like for example, our great photos from this trip. But if you don't feel like showcasing your photography, you can also subscribe to these art channels they have inside the app, feeds where you can just see real artists' work that cycles through, and it's just presenting you with cool, beautiful stuff on your wall without you putting any effort in. But to find out more about the Meural Wi-Fi photo frame, just click the link in the description below. So the R is going to be our reference point for all this, and I'll kind of let you know where other cameras sit in comparison to it. Let's start with the sensor. Again, it is full frame, just like the other cameras we're talking about here. And I love that when you open it up, the shutter hides the sensor. Good thing to know about the RP is it does not do that. So that's one of the upgrades you're getting with the R. Also happens on the R6 and R5. And don't open it at home, but taking a look inside, this is basically the exact same sensor as in the 5D Mark IV, which is an older camera, and I think some people consider a downside, but I think it's amazing. I think the 5D is part of the kind of plateau that full frame cameras have been hitting for a while now. It's not that it's perfect. Some cameras have gotten better, but not a lot better. Pixel peepers, and I know there are some of you out there, you're probably commenting something mean right now. You can notice differences, but professionals typically don't care. I still know a lot of people working on older 5Ds that are very happy with it, and their clients don't mind either. So to differentiate, the RP is similar to the 60, and it has a little less dynamic range, doesn't have as great of low light. The R is really solid. You're really not making any serious compromises there. And then with the R6 and R5, you're getting better ISO and ISO invariance, but it's not super significant. I wouldn't choose those cameras just because of the image quality. That's not the most important thing there. I do think the 30.3 megapixels of the R is the sweet spot. That's exactly the right amount of megapixels for me. Another thing Canon did great is the compressed RAW format on this, which makes your file size smaller. And on the 5D, that also gave up a bunch of dynamic range. I'm happy to say that on the R, it doesn't. It is more like JPEG artifacting, which for web doesn't really matter. So when we're shooting for web use, a lot of the time I use compressed RAW. It's on all of these cameras. I love it. It's just a good step forward from Canon. And then something bad about image quality. The ISO invariance on this is not great. I keep using that word. What does that mean? The typical use case is you will underexpose at a lower ISO and then raise the exposure in post so that you get more dynamic range. This is a little noisy if you do that, and it's much improved on the newer cameras. So that's probably the most significant step forward with the R6 and the R5. By the way, if you want to know more about the R6, I have a complete review on that. R5 is coming eventually, and I've talked about both of them a lot on the podcast, so just search for Stallman Podcast wherever you get them. I have other YouTubers and great photographers on there. We go way into depth on this stuff, so there's a lot more information there. If you need to shoot really high ISOs, which right now Sony has the reputation for being the leader there, I would recommend the R6. It's going to do the absolute best job of it. But I don't think it's that important of a difference with any of these, including the A7S III. To me, like if you're shooting up to 3200, that's safe on all of these cameras, maybe except the RP, that'd be pushing it a bit. But that's like the normal range. If you're shooting way past that, you're doing something crazy and none of them look great. You just can use it in the R6 or the A7S 3 or 2 or whatever you want to call it. Moving on from image quality, let's talk about lens mounts. So the R uses the RF mount, which we have started to become familiar with, and I've only recently been really sold on it. This is now my favorite lens mount. I didn't even appreciate it actually from owning this camera. What really got me into it was actually shooting with the Red Komodo, which has also taken on that mount. And I realized that this is extremely versatile because you can adapt it to pretty much anything. I'm mostly still using older EF lenses, but of course the new Canon RF lenses are incredibly sharp. The biggest problem with them, there's not enough small lenses. So this is the 35 1.8. Most of the new Canon lenses are enormous and expensive. But if you're open to adapting glass, I think RF is really one of the best mount options out there right now. I love it. But smaller lenses, Canon, please. Sony is doing better at this, and so is Fuji. That's where they're behind. Canon, smaller lenses, smaller lenses. Now, how about autofocus? Again, the R is right in the middle. It has 5,655 autofocus points. The number's not really important. Basically, it does a very good job of identifying subjects and tracking them through the scene, but it will sort of slip off of the subject. So it does a great job of finding the eye, but then it'll sort of like drift away to other subjects in the scene. I don't like that at all. So the newer cameras do a much better job of actually tracking as anything happens. It can look at the back of the head. It can really follow subjects anywhere. Whereas the R and the RP will do a good initial single shot, but have a harder time tracking, following. So if you're doing any kind of action photography or video work, definitely look at the R6 or the R5. If it's more still life, this is completely fine. It does better than a 5D Mark IV. In my books, I'd actually say the biggest differentiator between all of these cameras is the physical interface on the back and how you use them. The R and the RP really encourage you to use the touchscreen interface and navigate through digital menus to change anything, which I hate. I really don't like that. I want physical controls, and the R6 and the R5 have them. In my book, that's a lot of the reason the R6 and R5 are the professional cameras and the others are not, because they have basically the same controls as the 5D or the 1DX. Like all the stuff you need is there and you can memorize it. And if you are looking through the viewfinder, you don't have to take your hands off of one part of the camera and move them. You don't have to pull it away from your face. Let's just for real. You can keep manipulating stuff without pulling it away. And that is really hard on here. There's some things like I think ISO and white balance, I don't think you could even change without taking it away. So that's the number one reason I want to switch from the R. It's not the image quality, it is the usability. It slows you down. So let's sum it up for photography. The RP is going to be great for web use. In most situations, you really won't be able to tell it apart. It looks great, but it is missing some dynamic range and controls that the R does have. So the R is going to get you to that sweet spot of image quality where it's indistinguishable from other professional cameras. You could use it for anything. You're really missing out on the usability stuff that the R6 and the R5 have in spades. They work the way a real camera should work. Plus they can get your megapixels way up and your frames per second and all the sort of fancy features that honestly aren't as important as like just usability and image quality in my books. But of course we live in a hybrid world where we also shoot video. So I'm going to kind of quickly go through the video stuff. The RP does not include log, which is important to me. I kind of always shoot in log. The R does a very good job of having a thick 8-bit log codec, so you can grade it without it completely falling apart. But the R6 and R5 shoot in internal 10-bit. That is very important because you never get banding, you never get crazy artifacts. It just is much easier to grade. But a downside of all of them right now is that C-Log, log format they use, Canon log, actually doesn't have great dynamic range. Like it's sort of bad actually, especially compared to Sony's S-Log3 that is available on the A7S III. That's going to have a lot more dynamic range. So Canon's got some catching up to do. They say that the R5 will have Canon Log 3, which is not their, this is very confusing. C-Log2 is the good one. Canon hasn't promised it. So Canon's going to be behind in the dynamic range video department for a little while. So the RP, if video is important, I'm going to like push it aside. I don't think you should be looking at it. You should be thinking about the R at least. The 1080 and 4K look very good. I shoot the 1080 quite often here on YouTube. The 4K crops a lot, like way too much. It's basically 1.8, which is painful. It will kind of match up to bigger cameras. Sometimes I'll shoot with it in the C200 that I'm on right now, and they look pretty similar in good lighting. It's really the dynamic range and the color depth that you lose. The R6 and the R5 will shoot full frame 4K and up to 8K on the R5. You've probably heard there's some overheating issues, but I'm not going to get into that here. I still think if you're a hybrid shooter, not primarily shooting video on them, they're going to work great. And a few other missing features from the R, you can't do 4K 60 or 4K 120, which the others can do, which is amazing. There's only one card slot, which is pretty bad. There really should be two. Both of the others have it. And actually, I've had this issue lately where my camera, it's just not going to sleep. I started doing this out of nowhere. It just never turns off no matter what I do in the menus. Does anybody know why this is happening? All right, well, we take a look at some of my favorite recent travel photos just to show that this camera, I think, can take pretty nice photos. I got a rant about comments I see all the time. People saying that because they've seen studio samples of Sony and Nikon outperforming the Canon, that there's not enough dynamic range and the Canon is crap, basically. Like they're way behind in all sorts of image quality stuff. Look, this isn't reflected in reality. This isn't how the photos turn out. If there was a few stop dynamic range in the Canons, pros wouldn't be using it. This is really stuff that only seems to show up under artificial situations. In reality, the photos turn out great, so do not worry about it. All right, let's sum it all up. I think it's actually pretty easy, even though there's a lot of cameras here. The RP is a great choice for amateurs wanting to step it up a bit. You're gonna get a ton of image quality, they're gonna look great, you don't have to spend that much money. The R is really a sweet spot. If you're a professional, you'll be frustrated at the controls, but you're not making any sacrifices in the final photo. So I would try to move up to either the R6 or the R5. I know there's only 20 megapixels on the R6, but that's not a big deal. Nobody notices the difference. Either of those are the choices that I think most professionals should be going with. Canon is sometimes slow to update, which actually can feel kind of good that you don't have this like rush to always be on top of the next model, which I've been on that Sony train, like where you just need the new one all the time. It can be stressful, you know? And let me know in the comments, which ones are you gonna buy? I will see you guys over at the podcast. That's Stallman Podcast. Search for it in YouTube and you'll find it. See you guys in the next video.